Hello, everyone. I'm David Pompiani. Welcome back to the channel. Today's guest is Richard Hansen, a leading expert on Mayan archaeology and the director of the Mirador Basin project. He's also a professor at Idaho State in anthropology. Using LIDAR technology, Richard Hansen and his colleagues have put together the most comprehensive map of El Mirador, a pre-classic Maya city, one of the biggest and most important at that time, and revealed a lot of detail about the site that was before unseen because it was more or less hidden in the jungle. He revealed many new structures through the LIDAR mapping work, including hundreds of kilometers of roads and causeways and ditches that connected these sites. His work is challenging how we understand the development of early cities, political power, and the rise of complex societies in the Americas. So, Richard, hello, welcome to the channel.
Thank you, David. Great to be here. Thank you for the opportunity to participate with you today.
So I've been looking forward to talking to somebody that has explored and worked on some of these cities, especially in Central America, that have been, and the Amazon basin, and Amazon in general, where they've been documenting a lot of sites using LIDAR in regions that were before, pretty hard to survey or document. And so I'm excited to get to talk to you because you've worked on, in your recent paper, it was in a 2022 or 2023 paper in Ancient Mesoamerica, where you're the lead author among many other colleagues. You published a high resolution LIDAR analysis of the contiguous Mirador Calakmul Karst Basin. How do you say that part?
Cool.
Calakmul Karst Basin in Guatemala. And it kind of pulled together and created a more comprehensive picture of this huge settlement in the Guatemala rainforest. So I'm glad you're here, basically.
Great. Yeah, we were fortunate with that paper. It actually, when you look at the metrics on that paper, it's one of the top 1% of the 26 million papers ever published.
Wow.
Any subject. So it shows an interest in the subject. It shows an interest in Guatemala, and it shows an interest in the Maya. And we were fortunate to have that paper out. And excuse me. One of the other advantages of that paper is that in that study is that we did it on a regional basis. All other studies simply did it on a site basis, or they do a site and they piecemeal sites. We did it on the contiguous basin. But we did it in a high resolution format. At the time, because since the canopy is still intact in this area, it's the last tropical forest left in Guatemala. Because the canopy was intact, I was scared to death to spend a lot of money. And this is a expensive process. This is $1 million piece of work there. But I was scared to death that they would say, well, the canopy was too thick. We didn't get much reading to give us $1 million, So we used the highest resolution possible, and it panned out. It did great work, and we were able to do the whole contiguous basin. We did it with an airplane in 2015 and again in 2018. And now we're using drones, but the drones are slower. They have a higher resolution still, but we find that even the higher resolutions creates a lot of noise.
Okay.
A lot of digital noise that we don't need. So it's actually better for us. About 600,000 points per second is about the best resolution we can find, rather than the million or even 1.5 million points per second, because it just creates too much noise, digital noise, and it takes the supercomputers too long to process the data.
And what kind of resolution does that translate to on the ground for your map?
Because of the technology we used at the time, we're getting about 5.2 points per square meter, which is pretty exceptional to get that kind of a reading, especially in dense tropical foliage, dense tropical jungle. So as a result, it proved to be very useful This allows to even determine the looters' trenches and details in architecture that you wouldn't have seen in the lower resolution studies. Also, it allowed us to be able to determine architectural features that aren't visible on the lower resolution studies. But again, we went to higher resolution and found that it just created too much noise. We had the best resolution, about 600,000 points per
Okay.
second.
So for
And
the
we
people
flew
that
for
are
158 hours shooting that kind of density of points.
158 hours of surveying
Yeah.
using the dragging the sensor over the site with, or flying it over with airplanes and drones
Over the basin. Yeah,
over
it's
the
over the
basin.
basin. Now, I have to point out that because of that, we discovered 964 Maya sites,
Mm-hmm.
and half
Yeah.
of them are unnamed. We don't even have names for them yet. And those 964 sites form 417 cities, towns, and villages in the basin. So as a
Wow.
result, it's one of the most extraordinary concentrations of large and early cities in the world.
That's fantastic. So for the people that are watching that don't know much about LIDAR, LIDAR is an acronym for light in detecting and ranging. It's a,
Light detection and ranging. Yes, it
yes,
is.
light detection and ranging, which is a sensor that sends out light and it reflects off the ground. It comes back to the sensor and it can put together three-dimensional maps of the ground, digital renderings. And you're saying that you're getting 5 points of light per meter squared over the basin. And that's what's being used to interpolate and generate this three-dimensional map that you published in this ancient Mesoamerica article in
Yes,
2023.
that's true.
Okay,
Yeah,
so that is what light detection and ranging. So people that are not like map makers, they may have seen, the U.S. geological topography maps, the USGS topo maps. You probably have seen other maps that use contour lines. LIDAR is like the 21st century version of topography maps. It can
yes.
create a very high resolution three-dimensional rendering of the surface that includes things like pyramids, like human settlements. And you said even looters trenches come out in this because they're
Yeah, we can
probably
spot.
bigger than a meter squared. And
Oh,
so
yeah.
what your data can show, maybe in the future it'll get better, but you're getting information down to about a meter squared. So anything on the ground bigger than a meter squared, you can pick up in this map,
Yeah,
right?
it shows up. And again, this was a technology that what it does, it spreads a laser. We use dual laser systems when we did it. So it's dual laser.
Mm-hmm.
And we flew about 400 meters above the ground, 500 meters above the ground with an airplane, shooting this with this instrument, just back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, all across the basin, the entirety of the basin. And as a result, it let us see the entire topography. And
Mm,
of course, the topography lets you see all the Maya buildings and all the Maya pyramids and platforms and causeways under that canopy of jungle, which is completely opened it up. We were the pioneers of using what we call total station technology, beginning in 1989, which was a theodolite that sent a laser beam to a mirror and bounced back to the theodolite, which gave us a precise horizontal and vertical elevation of the mirror. And
mm,
then we just move out. So to map in a jungle, all we had to do was clear enough vegetation for the laser beam. We didn't have to clear cut the jungle to map it. And
mm,
we'd send just enough, we'd radiate out in a circle. So
mhm,
we had all these mirrors, and after we shot a point, the guy would move farther back out, and we keep shooting in the circle, going all the way around until we'd no longer see the mirrors. Then we'd move to a new central point. That let us map in 3D. So we were using 3D
mm,
technology with total station, but the LIDAR, and we mapped to the millimeter in
hmm,
accuracy. But the LIDAR was a night and day difference. In other words, even though we mapped to the millimeter in accuracy with total station technology, the LIDAR allowed us to see things that we never detected with the total station. And for
Yeah.
example, we found huge causeways. We found corrals for meat production on an industrial scale. We found causeways that we never would have recognized had we with traditional mapping methods. And so that technology opened up a whole new world. And it's done the same for other scholars in other parts of the Maya
Yeah.
world. And it's done the same for the
Mm-hmm.
Amazon, as you pointed out. The Amazon,
Yep.
that's exciting stuff because we had no idea of the sophistication of those sites in the Amazon. We thought they were
Yes.
hunters and gatherers, and they had no real social political complexity. Anthropologically, it was a problem because we have two societies living in the same environment. One becomes one of the greatest ancient civilizations of the world, and the other still remains hunting and gathering. So that
Mm.
was kind of a problem anthropologically, but now we know that there was a tremendous development architecturally. They didn't have the limestone that we have, and they didn't have the construction techniques that we have, but they had platforms and pyramids and causeways in the Amazon that we now can see with LIDAR too. So it's opened up a whole new campus, a whole new corpus of data that we'll be able to use for 500 years in the future. I doubt we'll ever have to remap any of these sites again, but once we have the LIDAR.
Describe to me the feeling of seeing that high resolution LiDAR map of Mirador for the first time. I'm going to show it on the screen because I can have it in your paper. Tell me what it felt like seeing it after working there for all those years.
Well, it's absolutely stunning. It was you're when you see these sites for the first time from that perspective, it was
Hmm.
stunning. We of course we had been looking at Mirador in 3D and other sites as well. We mapped 5 sites with total station technology. We were
Hmm.
looking at, we were accustomed to seeing it in 3D, but to see the detail that we have in with LiDAR in a real time situation was it was spectacular. And like I said, it allowed us to see things that we missed even with total station technology. And it let us find causeways and platforms and canals and ditches and structures that we didn't it had no idea that before. But that with that capability. So it was an
Hmm.
eye opener. It was a shock. We're preparing a book on the basin on the map of just El Mirador alone. We will do it at other sites as well. But the city of El Mirador itself is 132 square kilometers of major architecture, big buildings,
Wow.
meaning buildings that are higher than 12 meters in height. And I still just fascinated to sit and study that, look at that, and see the
Yeah.
incredible sophistication, the incredible economic, political, and social systems that must have been in place when this was at its apogee in the pre-classic periods, centuries before the time of Christ. The other thing that it did open up to us is the incredible amount of terrace constructions,
Hmm.
incredibly intricate and elaborate terrace formations that we knew were out there, but we didn't have any idea the scope and scale of the terrace constructions that allowed high density agriculture, which is, what gave them the economic capability to do what they're doing today. So to
Hmm.
do what they did anciently, I mean to say. It gave them the
Okay.
tremendous economic power to construct some of the largest buildings in the world at this period of time, and because of that high intensity agriculture productivity. None of the slash and burn that we find today in these cultures, even the Maya do it today, the slash and burn midden agriculture, that didn't exist anciently. They were
Hmm.
mapping intensively by using imported mud from these swamps. They were living in a whole regional areas of swamps, and they were dragging the mud out of these swamps and building these incredible terrace systems with imported mud. And that allowed them extraordinary agricultural capability. It allowed them to plant the same piece of ground over and over and over again for 1,000 years.
Very cool. And I want to get into that a little bit more. But for the viewer out there who has not studied this at all, let's step back and let's form like maybe a little bit of a background on Mirador and why it is considered, let's say, maybe the cradle of the Maya civilization. What was the significance of Mirador? Maybe describe its, you know, establishment, its growth, the dates, and what makes it so important and unique compared to even like places that are better known, like Tikal or the other big Maya, classic sites. Can you just talk about a little
Right.
bit of background on Mirador and why it's considered the cradle of the Maya civilization?
Well, this goes back to when the early explorations in the early 1900s, beginning with the Carnegie Institution, that wandered into these remote areas. These guys were out exploring these ancient Maya cities. And of course, great sites like Tikal with fabulous architecture, and Copan with the beautiful art and the monuments that are there, and Chichen Itza captured the
Mhm.
imagination of these lost ancient cities shrouded in jungle. It's kind of a romantic perspective of these ancient cities. And when they went to, as far as I knew about Tikal, and they wanted to get a site that was more of a smaller so they could understand the sequence. And they went to a site called Washaktun, 24 kilometers to the north of Tikal, beginning in 1922. And they excavated the Washaktun and they found major excavation. They found all the evidence of these classic period vaulted buildings and beautiful rooms and sophisticated ceramics with hieroglyphic texts. They found monuments with hieroglyphic text on them. And then they found this one pyramid, 8 meters high, under a classic period pyramid. And they dismantled the classic period pyramid and found this 8 meter high preclassic structure. 40 years, that was the only example of preclassic architecture in the Maya world. And therefore, the model was before the time of Christ was preclassic. They were hunters and gatherers. And in the classic period from about 300 AD to 900 AD was the classic period of Maya
Yeah.
civilization. The late classic was 600 to 900 AD, and that was the pinnacle, the apogee of their culture. Then there was a collapse of the demographic collapse around 900 AD. And then the Maya settled along the coastal areas in sites like Tulum and Mayapan and later parts of Chichen Itza were all these post-classic sites that were around when the Spanish came. Even when the Spanish came able to see these sites. What we didn't know, though, was the incredible complexity in the pre-classic. And when I began excavating in January of 1979 on a building that I was assigned to, I was working in Israel at the time. And I was invited by a professor from a Catholic university named Bruce Dolan and a professor from Brigham Young University named Ray Matheny to go and work at a site called Mirador. Dolan had been in there the year before and had done some temporary preliminary work in the swamps out there. And so they invited me in, and since I had a lot of experience in architecture, they assigned me one of the large buildings, a 17-meter high pyramid there. And as I excavated, I found the walls of the rooms on the top of the pyramid. And as I came down on the floor, I found the pre-classic pottery right on the floor.
Hmm.
And they had assured me the building had to be classic because it was so sophisticated. It had cornices and it had air ventilation systems in it. It had the elaborate large size. It was 17 meters high. The other pre-classic building was 8 meters high. You see, and these were the hunters and
Hmm.
gatherers. So to find that pre-classic pottery on the floor was a stunner. Because was it a museum or what was it? Why was the classic period covered with pre-classic pottery? Was there something did the pre-classic pottery extend later into the classic period? We didn't
How could you
know.
tell it was pre-classic pottery?
It's a red monochromes, and they have specific
Hmm.
forms. They're red, black, and
Yeah.
cream monochromes usually.
Okay.
And it was, but the forms were very diagnostic. Ceramics are like a car. A 1925 model is a lot different from a 1950 model. It's a lot different from a 2000 model, and that's a lot different from a 2025 model. And the
Yeah.
ceramics are the
Yeah.
same. That changes through time. So when you find that these certain type of ceramics, you relatively know the time period that it belongs to. Then we use other dating methods as well, such as carbon-14, which, by the way, is quite accurate now. They're getting down to plus or minus 15 or to 30 years of accuracy. So we use that dating as well. But when I found that preclassic pottery on the floor, we had to explain that. How is it that we have this sophistication so much earlier? And it was actually throwing it back 1,000 years of sophistication. Well, now that was, and at the time, it took 20 years to convince our colleagues that there were pre-classic cities and with 80-meter pyramids. I mean, these were hunters and gatherers. They couldn't be constructing 80-meter pyramids. So we completely disrupted the evolutionary trajectory of Maya civilization. And we have a much more accurate view now. And thanks to many other scholars working on pre-classic sites throughout Mesoamerica, they're able to confirm that same perspective, that there was a huge development before the time of Christ. It collapsed, a demographic collapse of considerable proportions, and then it rose again in the classic period. So we have this two big apogees of classic Maya sophistication.
So that kind of, you answered the second question I wanted to, ask you about. How did these LIDAR data essentially change the way you looked at the pre-classic Maya? I mean, when looking through the paper, you mentioned earlier you found you documented something like 960 settlements, several 177 plus kilometer network of pre-classic causeways that link settlements. You found triadic pyramids, platform constructions, you call some E-groups, water management systems. So clearly, these are not hunter-gatherers, but you also mentioned they are making pottery. So they knew pre-classic people were making pottery, and usually, at least in North America, the archaic hunter-gatherer period is characterized by the lack of pottery.
Well,
But
yeah,
they were
we
still
do archaic
agriculturalists.
pottery. We do have archaic pottery here, but you're right. The earliest pottery appears on the Pacific coast of Guatemala and Chiapas, Mexico, about 1600 BC.
Okay.
However, it is surprisingly sophisticated, and so it must have been imported from some other area. The technology, because the sophistication of that pottery is unbelievable, about 1600 BC, but it doesn't appear in the Maya lowlands till about 1000 BC, and so that's when we find it. I've got evidence of human presence in the basin 2600 BC. So they're out there, they're living in the jungle, they're moving around, but they're not building anything permanent. They have perishable structures. They had carved post holes in bedrock to hold the posts up on perishable buildings, and they were raising corn. We have corn pollen from these early dates, but we don't have ceramics. No ceramics from that
Okay.
time period. So they
So
may
in a
have been
way,
using
maybe,
baskets or some other things, but they weren't using ceramics to about 1000 BC.
okay. And it sounds like then maybe the arrival of ceramics kind of demarcates the beginning of the early pre-classic Maya period.
Well,
Like
it's
maybe,
interesting to note that when the ceramics appear, they're starting to make permanent settle.
yeah. So that sounds like they're starting to get a little bit more settled down. They need to store things, store water, store corn,
Right?
and it sounds more sedentary type lifestyle. Okay, that's interesting. And you mentioned also you found evidence of corrals in this pre-classic site.
Yes,
And
we never would
what
have
were they? Yeah,
estimated this area if it hadn't been for LIDAR.
and
We never
what
would
were they
have.
raising?
If you find a little, I mean, you're out in dense vegetation, you can't see 5 feet in any direction, and you find a low
Mm-hmm.
wall about a meter high, and well, that's an interesting wall. And you walk 40 meters, 40 yards, or 50 yards, and you find another low wall. That's an interesting wall, but you don't relate it to the gridded corral system. And these were gridded corrals. I mean, these were dozens and dozens and dozens of these corrals that were constructed that we never would have found without the LIDAR. So because of
What
that,
were they raising in the corrals?
I sent a team to excavate that. And then we discovered the corrals. We sent a team from the University of California, Davis, and Brigham Young University. Richard Terry is one of the professors at BYU that specializes in ancient soils. We sent the team out there to excavate those things, and the conclusion they came to was that it was for the production on an industrial scale of dogs and turtles. But we
Wow.
only excavated 6 of the corrals. There's probably white-tailed deer, and that they were have a semi-domesticated process, and the other animals that they were raising in these corrals that were allowed for meat production on an industrial scale. And
Wow.
so, but we never would have excavated that, and never would have even found it if it had been for the LIDAR. So the LIDAR opened that up to a whole new perspective on their diet. That's why we find a lot of dog remains in our faunal remains at the site. There's a lot of dog that they're eating. They're also eating, we find the white-tailed deer, they're eating triggerfish from the Caribbean Sea. And that was probably coming in, though, on as salted fish, not as fresh. I doubt that they would have hauled fresh fish that far. The Inca did it with a series of runners. But in that heat of humidity, I don't think it'd be possible in the Peten without the fish going bad. So I think they probably salted the fish and then brought in the fish as salted, dried and salted fish. And they were eating triggerfish. But we had a lot of other things in their diet too. We have corn, squash, beans, chocolate. They were producing on these terraces. And we find that also with a technology that we use to detect phytoliths. Phytoliths are silica plant remains in the cells of plants. When the plant dies and disappears, the silicate cell remains are still there. So we excavate these terraces, we can find where they're raising corn, where they're raising squash, where they're raising beans, where they're raising cotton, where they're raising chocolate. We find the silica remains from these plants still, and that lets us see the incredible agricultural sophistication they developed. We also know that they were developing what we call chinampa style system. Chinampas are where they excavate a canal, the soils make a canal out of it, and they transport the soils and build rows and rows and rows of elevated fields, which are highly productive. Extraordinary production, extraordinary organic wealth of that soil. And these chinampas are still in existence in the Basin of Mexico today. And we can see them. We can see them from the airplanes, and with LIDAR technology, we can see those rows and rows and rows of ancient fields where they dredged the mud out and built these elevated fields that had high productivity. And again, with that agriculture, it gave them a huge advantage culturally because they had the economic power to do what they did. Now, that said, everybody has assumed that agriculture is the prime mover of social, political, and economic complexity. But there's a cautionary tale there. I was invited by National Geographic to go see the site of Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. This is pre-agriculture, pre-ceramic, at 11,000 BC, for crying out loud. In the Ice Age, and most of the planet was in Ice Age. These guys were building extraordinary, complex temples with huge stones and elaborate walls and carvings on the stones, and I mean, it was remarkable sophistication. But what it shows is that agriculture was not the prime mover. It was ideology that was the prime mover. And so you have to always have the consideration when you're looking for the prime movers of social, political, and economic complexity. It's not just agriculture, but it's the ideology that promotes and generates cultural sophistication.
Or maybe like the motivation to conduct these kind of monumental architecture
Yeah, that's
tasks.
what I mean.
The
That's the prime
ideology.
mover. It makes it a prime
So
mover.
maybe correct me now. for those that have taken, like, let's say, an intro to anthropology class, intro to archaeology, world history, you always hear about surplus energy, and the development of specialists allows for the growth of sedentary societies and the civilization in general, writing, religion, social hierarchies. And you're saying Gobekli Tepe and maybe even these early pre-classic Maya are examples where complexity rises prior to agriculture and its surplus energy. Therefore, it may not be needed to, spur or create the impetus for these new developments in society. But I would say, when you look at your site, it clearly needed a lot of labor. Gobekli Tepe is fantastic, but these are religious memorial sites, if I'm remembering correctly, on top of hills. And in Turkey, they're not creating massive 100-kilometer causeways and
That's right.
all
That's
this and that.
another
So there's
level.
clearly an energy part of this equation. And I know you're tying it in with your terrace, that it's an absolutely productive landscape that's producing tons of energy. But for the person out there that's learning just about El Mirador, where did the labor come from? How was it voluntary? Was it a religious labor divided society? Kind of like they think the pyramid in Cahokia was built, Monk's Mound. It was maybe built by voluntary labor, fed with beer and corn and food and everything. Or
Yeah,
were these slaves?
that's a great
Or
question. That's a
maybe
great
you could talk to that.
That's a
Speak to
great
that.
question. We had to have there were hundreds of thousands of people in that city alone, in
Yes,
Mirador alone,
must have been.
not including the 417 other cities that we have out in the basin. Um,
Hmm.
must have been hundreds of thousands of people there. We calculated that by doing a series of experiments. And
Mm.
by this, I mean we had to get an idea on the volumetrics of buildings, especially a building like La Danta, which has a base of 600 meters and is 80 meters high by 600 by 300 meters, and the base of platforms, and then it goes all the way up to 80 meters high originally. It's now 72 meters high because we lost the top part of the building fell over centuries ago. But
Hmm.
the fact that these monumental buildings required such a volumetric of fill from quarries and soil and mud and rock and fill and ceramics that are all thrown in there. So we had to do the experimental work, and that's published in a couple of volumes actually, that have been published on all this experimental research that we did. But we found 6 quarries at Knock Bay, for example. We excavated those quarries, found the stone tool of those quarries, replicated the stone tools, and cut blocks to see if we could make the same marks on the blocks that the ancient Maya did. And we did. We found out exactly how they did it. We found the same type of tool mark damages on the tools. We found the same marks on the stone. We found the same marks on the tools from this type of experimental work. Then we quarried the blocks using those stone tools and the same size as the pre-classic blocks, and then we transported those blocks. So we knew how many men it took to move one block. For example, we
Mm.
discovered that it takes 2.8 man days of labor to make one pre-classic block, and it took 12 men to move one pre-classic block from the quarry 600 meters to the site of construction. So then we begin to, once we get the volumetrics of that involved, then we begin calculating how many blocks are in the building, how many cubic meters are in the building, and how much weight can a man carry in hot sun in a humid environment for 9 hours on his back. And we did all that experimental work too. How much labor is involved in this? And it required, for example, just to build the pyramid of Danta at Mirador, which was built in a single episode of construction, required between 10 and 15 million man days of labor to build. Now, if one person was working, do you know how many years 15 million man days is?
I was just going to ask that exact question.
41,000 years. If one person was working, it's 41,000 years
Yeah.
to build that building. So then we had to figure it out. How short a period of time was it built? We believe Dante, for example, was built during the government of one particular individual, because the stonework the same from the bottom to the top of the building. So if you gave a ruler 30 years of reign of government and reigning over his population, then it probably required 3,000 to 4,000 workers working day and night for 30 years to build that building. But you got to feed
Wow.
them. You got to water
Right.
them. You have to entertain
Right.
them. You have to police them. It requires all the trappings of economic complexity and political complexity to be able to commission that type of labor. What do you do, for example, if a guy says, I'm not going to haul that rock, it's too hot, not going to do it? Hmm?
Yeah.
Yeah,
You somehow force or coerce them or say you're going to burn in hell
that's
if you don't do
exactly
it.
right. That's exactly right. I think personally, as I looked at this, and if you had slave labor, for example, you have to have the military power to back it up. And what's the evidence for that? I'm more inclined to think at this stage that they had a tribute labor system where every family was assigned so many man days of tribute labor,
Mhm.
they had to commit
Mhm.
to doing this. For example, we find handprints of children in the mud of some of these buildings. So
Mm.
I'm inclined to suggest that they probably had instead of a tax like you and I have today to pay to the
Mhm.
government, they had a labor tax that was assigned to these people to build this. And
Yeah.
we're going to do more work on that, because we're going to, with these handheld spectroscopy instruments, we think we can detect the different quarries that stones were transported from. And we can see how many stones came from a certain quarry in this area, how many stones came from another quarry, and get some idea on the volumetrics and the labor construction of these big, massive pyramids. These are huge buildings, by the way. The three largest pyramids in the Maya world are found at El Mirador, but we have 13 other sites that have buildings larger than 30 to 40 meters in the basin. So it's a tremendous development of complexity that's occurring simultaneously in this system. We think it was a contained system because none of those causeways go outside the natural borders of the basin. The basin is
Mm.
defined by a ridge of hills, karstic limestone hills that rise 200 to 300 meters above the level, and these range of this like a cordillera. These range of hills completely surround the basin, and it contains the basin in this system. That's why the water stagnates in this area. We call it a basin because the water stagnates there. You have so many swamps, and
Yeah.
not one person lives in that whole basin today. Not one. You
So
know,
it's not that friendly
1.6
to human life today.
1.6 million acres of pristine jungle, and not one person lives in it.
Jeez, that is strange. Now, why did they have to build pyramids? Why were they describe how that fit into their religious beliefs and worldviews, and why was it important
So
for
now that
them?
we find pyramids in almost every ancient society in the world.
Right.
Pyramids are we find, but let's go to medieval Europe. You find
Hmm.
cathedrals in every little village, right? They're the
Hmm.
biggest, most spectacular buildings in the village. You find them
Hmm.
in every little town in Latin America. You find a beautiful big cathedral, a Catholic church.
Hmm.
These were ideology became an important prime mover here, because it was the religious fervor and the belief that there was God, and the belief in that the heavens controlled our destiny,
Hmm.
and that created a desire to build something that the gods would recognize. And the only thing that can do that has any kind of elevation structurally is a pyramid. Sometimes they're round, but most of the time they're rectangular or square. And let's you have elevation. You can look over the populace below. You can send signals to other sites and other cities from the elevated areas. You can, and it has a manifestation of the control of labor. If you're building a
Yeah,
native
right.
meter pyramid, by golly, you had a control of labor, and that
Yes.
implicates power and wealth.
Did they sacrifice people on these pyramids?
We don't know. That's a good question. We don't know. I was the consultant for a film called Apocalypto that I did with Mel Gibson. I was the consultant for that film, and we showed that sacrifice taking place was very common. And that's what you see in the film. It's what was going on 1511 AD. But a lot of that was
Right.
Aztec
Yeah.
influence. A lot of that was Aztec influence.
Aztec.
I
Yes.
don't have
Yes.
that
Not
kind of,
pre-classic Maya.
we don't have that kind of evidence in the pre-classic. I'm certain there
Okay.
were ritual executions, you know.
Sure.
I'm certain that they had ritual executions. If you beat a drum and play a flute when you execute somebody, is that a sacrifice or is it an execution, But
Right.
they didn't have. We don't have the evidence for the wholesale mass sacrifices that we find in the post-classic periods. Sites like Chichen Itza or even in Tenochtitlan in Mexico City, we actually have the skull racks with the hundreds and hundreds of skulls they've just found
Yeah.
in the Zocalo of Mexico City with the skulls still in place, So this was ritual sacrifice on a massive scale in those sites. And according to the Spanish chroniclers who came to sites like Zempoala, which was on the coast of Veracruz, they were doing sacrifices there too, And the Spanish were horrified. They were stunned that these sacrifices were taking place. And one of the reasons the conquest of Mexico was able to take place is because a lot of people resented the Aztecs for that type of predatory behavior on their part, just to capture victims for sacrifice. And they joined up with the Spanish to fight against the Aztecs.
Right
So,
against the Aztecs.
but in the pre-classic, we don't have evidence for that kind of sacrificial behavior. Although we saw in the classic period in some graffiti, we find evidence of a heart being extracted, and we find, but we don't have the evidence except at a site called Kolha, which has something like 35 human skulls at the base of the stairway where they've been decapitated. But that's in the one side of Kolha. We don't find that in other sites. So that's a good question. That's some more work that will be done on that to refine that knowledge.
So for someone watching, I guess let's just recap the pre-classic Maya, which we're talking about here in Mirador. This is in the BC era, 1000 BC approximately to AD 150.
Right.
These at Mirador are not known for the heart, the sacrificing, ripping out the heart. That's associated with the Aztec and the late classic Maya,
Post-classic.
near
Yeah.
and post-classic, closer to the time when the Spanish contact and see these.
That's
And
right.
I think because in the public, people hear about the Maya and they don't know Inca, Maya, Aztec. We're the guys that made the big heads that are in Central America. The public doesn't understand the difference. Usually it gets confusing. So it's good to be clear here. We're in the world before the post-classic Maya, the Aztec. We're even before the proper Inca, even though that's South America, because that's near contact as well. Yeah, we're over 2,000 years ago, and this is the beginnings of these kind of centralized urban centers in Guatemala area proper. That's why Mirador is sometimes called the cradle of the Maya civilization, because this is the earliest evidence for this large scale construction and so on. And in the beginning of the conversation here, you mentioned something that I didn't take notes on, but I am fascinated by. So you said the pre-classic society kind of had a demographic collapse around early AD 150-ish. And this was like a collapse before the classic, because the classic, post-classic Maya, that collapsed around 900 AD
That's
with
right.
the so-called drought. Which I do think there's a good evidence for that drought. I shouldn't put quotes up. That's the famous collapse, but people don't know about this earlier collapse. Can you talk about when did the Mirador begin to maybe collapse? I know that word is sometimes among archaeologists is not the best word, but I mean, just to be simple,
No, it
when
is
did the Mirador?
exactly the right
You like
word.
the word?
Some of the
Yeah. It
well
doesn't mean they left.
colleagues don't like, they like to say the Maya resilient and they survived all these. These were demographic demises, demographic collapse,
Yeah.
and there's two words that are crucial there. Two words that are crucial. The first word's
Okay.
abandonment. Abandonment always
Okay.
occurs because of warfare or drought or a disease, you know. For example,
Yeah.
for
For
example,
example.
we dropped a bomb on two cities in World War II in Japan. Within 3 years, they were reoccupied. So is that a collapse or is it an abandonment?
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah.
It's an abandonment. We firebombed Dresden, Germany in World War II. Are the people in Dresden today? Of course. We had the
Yeah, I
Black
see what you're
Plague
saying.
in London in the
Yeah.
1400s, 1300s. Are there people in London today? Of course. So that's not a collapse. That's an abandonment. We have droughts where people have to leave and then they come back when the drought. These are never collapses. A drought or warfare or disease are never collapses. They're abandonments because when the stress is
Ah,
gone, they return.
I see.
A
I see.
collapse occurs when they leave and they never come back, or they come back hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of years later. All right.
Yes.
That's a
Yes.
collapse. Now, what is it that creates a collapse? Well, when you look on a world scale where this occurs, for example, Babylon, is anybody living in the vicinity of Babylon today? No. But why? Well, when they farmed those fields, they brought water from the Tigris, Euphrates rivers. They brought them across salt domes and salinized all their fields. It's all salt. You can't farm, you can't raise anything there. And the same with Chernobyl. When can we get back into Chernobyl in Ukraine? Say safely. About
Yeah.
10,000 years. So it's always, when you have a collapse, it's always, always, always tied to environment. It's not that you leave, it's that you don't come back. Because everybody would
Mm,
want to come back for the same reasons they built those cities in the first place. Why wouldn't they come back
right.
why wouldn't some Maya said, I want to come back and reclaim this pyramid that my granddaddy built and I'm going to continue the legacy? They didn't do it, and they didn't do it for hundreds of years. And when they left whole pot sitting right on the floors of their buildings. I even found a stone
Wow.
tool with the flakes from the stone tool still sitting around the stone tool. They left and they walked away forever, and nobody came back 100 years later and said, "Oh, look at this old pot. I'm going to take it home and put it on the mantle." You know,
Yeah.
they abandoned it and they left it for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, and in some cases till the present day. So it's been a 2,000 years of abandonment out there. And what creates that is always environmental. So we had to try to explain what was the environmental destruction that took place to create that abandonment. And to do that, we began excavating in the swamps. The swamps out in in the basin, and about 64% of the basin are what we call bajos. They're seasonal swamps. In the rainy season, they fill up with water. In the dry season, the clay sets up like cement, and it's just like solid cement. It's hard to work and hard to live in it. But we dig pits out in the bajos. We find that rich organic layer of mud that they were harvesting in the pre-classic periods under 2 to 3 meters of sterile clay. What would create such a deforestation to allow that much deposition, that much sedimentation? And we begin to suspect the use of lime cement. Now, to make lime cement, you have to burn limestone,
Yeah.
900 degrees
Yes. Yes.
centigrade. You have to burn at 900 degrees centigrade and convert the limestone into a powder, which we call quicklime. It's an actual chemical process. And then when you add water to it, it has a violent reaction. And of course, then that can be shaped and molded and formed. And that's how they put lime cement on all their causeways, lime cement on all their plazas, lime cement on all their buildings, and all their big architectural art was all lime cement. And we noticed through time that the average floor at 800 BC was about 4 centimeters thick. But by the time of Christ, the average floor was 12 to 14 centimeters thick, and some of those floors were 50 centimeters thick of lime cement. Why do you need a floor 50 centimeters thick of lime cement? Because you can.
Okay.
Because you have the economic, political, and social power to do it. There are people urinating in gold-plated toilets today. Why? Because they
can
can.
buy them. Yeah.
Right, they can. We are $36 trillion in debt in the U.S. Why?
We're the big guy on the block. We can.
Because we can. That's exactly
Print
right.
the money.
Mentality. You see that how that mentality extends to the present day. We
You're right.
We abuse it. We tend
So
to
they need
abuse that kind of a thing because of wealth and power.
Mm-hmm.
And this is why we're $36 trillion in debt. But there's the advantage we have from archaeology is we can see the consequences of that kind of stupidity. And it is stupidity.
Yeah. So you're saying they cut down all their trees.
Once to understand that, I sent a team for 6 years from Berkeley, led by a guy named Dr. Tom Schreiner. He went all over Mesoamerica documenting how much wood it takes and how much limestone does it take to make 1 ton of lime. And we studied that for 6 years. We even brought in all the old lime burners from all over Mesoamerica and had them build their lime kilns near Flores on one year. And we quantified the amount of wood and the amount of stone and what was the productivity, and discovered that it takes 5 to 6 tons of stone and 5 to 6 tons of green wood. It can't be dry wood because dry wood burns too hot too fast and dies down too fast. It had to be green wood to maintain the 900 degrees centigrade temperature to convert limestone into quicklime. We discovered it takes 5 to 6 tons of green wood as well to convert the limestone into this quicklime cement. And so then once we understood that process, then we went into quantifying how much lime was used in the buildings. And for example, just to cover the last cap, the last stucco covering on Tigre Pyramid required something like, if I recall right, and I'm not kidding, I published a paper on this, I think it was something like 734 acres of every single living tree. So when they stripped their jungle, then the natural clays washed down into those swamps and buried that rich organic layer of mud under meters of sterile clay. And so that when you can't eat, you gotta do something different. And they did. They left. But the question so much isn't why did they leave? The question is why didn't they come back? And the reason is because they couldn't come back because of the environmental damage they had done. Now, ultimately, the Maya did come back into the basin, but they did it in an area that had relatively low pre-classic populations. They did it in the northern part of the basin, which is where Calakmul now is. So they eventually ended up they went from Mirador to the coast. From the coast, it looks like they went to Zibanche, a site in Quintana Roo, and from there they went back to the basin and in Calakmul. And Calakmul is a large classic period site. It has more monuments than any other Maya site in the Maya world. And they became a superpower in the classic period. So that's kind of in a nutshell the story of how the limestone and how lime cement affected the deforestation process which created the deposition of sterile clay, which exists naturally in limestone, the deposition of sterile clay over these rich organic layers. It's essentially killing the goose that lays the golden egg. They killed.
Yeah. And they call these, I've heard of these Maya clays and lakes and Bajos. And why do you keep saying sterile clay? What do you mean by sterile clay that's
You can't
in
raise
these?
anything in it. Only the trees grow, these stubby, scummy, thorny trees that grow in these Bajos areas. It's hard. It's hard to cement in the dry season. It's inundated in the wet season. Nothing survives very well in those, and you can't plant in there. That's why there's no population there today. That's why you don't have
Got
any
it.
villages in the area today. They can't raise crops in there.
Where did the sterile clay? It comes from
It
basically
exists
you cut
naturally
the
in limestone.
trees.
It
Okay, yeah,
exists.
you
As
cut.
limestone deteriorates, it creates this clay material that washes down into these. Once you strip the vegetation, it washed
Right.
down into those swamps.
Yeah, so they cut the trees down. This is a rainforest jungle. Fully large trees were cut down to burn the limestone. This exposes the soil. The top organic layer is removed from erosion. And below that, you're saying, is this sterile clay that's weathering off of the limestone
Right.
bedrock
And that washed
that's
down into the.
underlying the basin.
That's right.
I've seen that. On a side note, I worked at Cahokia in North America, and I call it the Cahokia clay in Horseshoe Lake.
Yeah.
And I published it, and it's very strange because I looked through the literature and I found throughout the Maya lowland, these clay layers, the dates to the time of the classic, in this case, the pre-classic. But there's also a clay layer up at Cahokia, and
That's
they did
fascinating.
not
But you're right.
use any.
It's not productive.
Well, no, maybe I don't know about that, but it is productive from the standpoint of corn today. It was clearly a collapse because Cahokia never was fully reoccupied, and they stopped building monumental architecture there, like 1200 or something AD. But there's a clay layer in the lake nearby, but they did not construct anything out of stone. This is what I was trying to get at. Their whole society is built out of wood, wattle and daub, earthen mounds. Yet still, there's a clay layer. So I'm thinking, and there's this big debate among archaeologists that they're saying there's no evidence for deforestation around Cahokia, but they built palisade walls around Monk's Mound several times over the course of 1 century, and they're made of oak trees and hickory trees that are like big. This wall is like a mile. I don't know exactly, but it's miles long, maybe a couple miles of total circumference. And there's still a clay layer there. To me, that sounds like there was a big landscape change, but there's a debate, and I don't want to, get into the details of that. But
It is a good hypothesis that can be tested. And that's the
mhm,
advantage of that, is that based on, and a hypothesis is always at the end of an investigation, not at the beginning. It's always
mhm,
at the end of an investigation, and then you can test it. And you go through the whole
yeah,
the scientific process, you test that out. We've done that multiple times and came up with the same conclusion, that this was the impact of massive deforestation out there was not because of agriculture. It was because of the conspicuous consumption of resources. If they would have maintained their
mm,
4 centimeters, they would have never had the problem.
mm,
They wouldn't have created that massive deforestation to feed that lime thing. But again, let's go back to we're $36 trillion in debt in the U.S.
yeah,
Why did that happen? It's the same mentality. Do you see that? It's the same
mhm,
mentality. And we have the same virtues, we have the same vices as they had 2 to 3,000 years ago, because we're human.
mhm,
That's part of our human nature, and we have to be able to recognize and realize the corrections that you have to do to correct a society from, and sometimes that's a painful process. Sometimes that's something that a big king wouldn't want to do. If he wanted a floor 50 centimeters thick, by golly, he better have his floor, right?
mhm. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so we even see that play today in our modern politics.
Yeah.
There's a
Yeah.
correction that needs to take place. And boy, there's
Right.
protesting and they're fighting and they're burning cars and they're invading dealerships because the correction has to take place, or we're going to fall into a quagmire that we'll never, ever extract ourselves from. So, and that's one of the advantages of archaeology. We can't see our beginnings because that occurred in the past. We can't see our end because that's in the future. We only live in the present. When you look at a society from the lens of archaeology, you see the beginnings, you see what they did right, you see the things that they were doing, you see the dynamics they did to maintain it, and you see what they did that took them to hell. And when you look at it through that lens of archaeology, it gives a whole new perspective on social dynamics, on social and economic prosperity and social and economic collapse. And it gives a whole new perspective on what we can learn by looking at the past so we don't repeat the mistakes of the past.
It's a very important point, and a reason that we should study archaeology is we have these case studies where we can see where people, what they did right, what they did wrong,
Right.
and maybe hopefully use that to steer our society in the present, because we are a fairly complex society dependent on agriculture and a lot of other things, just like they were. Now,
Well, you and I are here because somebody's out busting their rear end so we can eat. If you were looking
true.
for a gopher and a grasshopper to eat tomorrow, you wouldn't be doing this podcast. And I wouldn't be reading these books. I'd be out looking to see what rabbit can I find so I can live tomorrow. You
Right.
see,
Yeah.
and these are all things we take for granted because we live in a complex society. Can you imagine the guy at 200 BC and 300 BC at El Mirador imagining that there would be jungle all over his buildings and jaguars and crocodiles in their cities?
Yeah.
That was unfathomable when you look at the grandeur and the majesty at
Of the
100 AD. Who was thinking that Rome would be nothing but a pile of ruins?
Yeah.
Who was thinking
Yeah.
that? You see,
Yeah. Yeah.
you're right. That's where these lessons can become important lessons, and archaeology and history are crucial elements to understand
Mhm.
the social implications of behaviors.
Hmm. You said you saw a tool with the flakes right next to it. You saw a pot on the ground that looked like someone set it
Yeah,
down, and they're like,
dozens of whole pots right on the ground.
yeah.
Yes,
Now, when did that happen? Your best guess.
about 150 AD.
150 AD. What do you base that timing on? Is that a radiocarbon date or
Yeah,
tree rings
carbon
or?
dates, and the ceramics change after that.
Okay. So 150 AD, they are abandoning this site. There are these
Not
sterile
only this site,
clays.
dozens of cities at the same time.
Yeah, let's call it the whole basin,
Right.
and dozens, which includes many 964 settlements, according to your LIDAR paper, 775 in the basin and 189 in the surrounding ridges. So at 150 AD, this happens. Now, you're mentioning the clays. They have deforested this site, lived beyond their means to cook all this limestone. Why 150 AD? Did a drought hit when the deforestation, or was there a severe hurricane that washed all this clay and made their field sterile? Can you speak to maybe the
I think
specific
I think
reasonings for that time
I think by that
or
time the
things?
level of conspicuous consumption was exorbitant,
Okay.
and so then you combine that with a drought. When you deforest massive areas,
Yeah.
you impact
Yes.
the rainfall pattern horrifically, and we're seeing that today. We
Mm.
find horrific differences we didn't have that difference in rainfall. Now we find it now. and they're
Well,
going to find.
especially infiltration into the ground. That, I mean, there's a lot more runoff when you deforest a
Well, you get less rain.
hillside.
Important part of the rainfall in the tropics is the movement of water from the trees
Mm.
to the
Oh, I see.
actual vegetation.
So you're saying even the scale was so big that the vegetation removal even affected the transpiration of water from the ground up into the air.
Evapotranspiration is a huge factor in tropical forests. And when you
Okay.
when you just disrupt those tropical forests, the evapotranspiration can't work adequately. And another interesting study done by the University of Alabama a few years ago was the ground temperature at areas that were deforested versus areas that were not deforested. And I think they found between 4 and 7 degrees centigrade difference in temperature on the deforested areas as opposed to the forested areas, which means that even you got the same amount of rain in both areas, the deforested area much more desiccated. So it was never, you never could catch up. And the idea was if you kept that process going, the tropical forests of the Yucatan would essentially be a Sahara, because it completes the desiccation continues and continues and continues. We look at the Sahara today, we know the Sahara today was not the Sahara as it was at 10,000 BC. 20,000 BC, 30,000 BC was a much different world there, you
Right.
see.
Mm-hmm.
And these are climate changes that occur naturally.
Right.
In some cases, cases they're anthropogenic. In the Maya case, I think it was anthropogenic.
I was just going to say that the Green Sahara, the early Holocene Green Sahara, that's driven by changes in like the
Ocean current.
ITCZ, yeah,
Right.
and other things like that. So I wouldn't say the end of the Green Sahara wasn't because they deforested the Sahara.
No,
But
that's
in the case of
what I'm saying. In
Mirador,
the case of the Maya, I think it was
yeah,
anthropogenic. Well,
for sure. I think there's pretty clear evidence. I didn't realize the lime story, because that is even today a huge energy sink in modern society, is creating lime,
right.
quick lime for cement for our highways, for our buildings. During the Roman time, that was expensive. It's a carbon intensive process. I did not know that about the pre-classic Maya, that they were using lime. Now, talking about this energy idea, this reminds me of something I wanted to bring up earlier, where you said you found evidence for corrals for raising dogs and turtles. Now, I want you to talk about, for the people that are not aware, the pre-classic Maya, the Maya in general, the Inca, Aztec, all before contact with Europeans, did not have beasts of burden. They weren't using horses. They were not using oxen. They had dogs. They had turkeys in the Southwest. I mean, turtles. It seems like they might have been trying to domesticate white-tailed deer, which is interesting. I wasn't aware of. In South America, there's the llama and alpaca, which weren't very good beasts of burden for at least building.
They were beasts of burden down there because they're a camelid, and the camel.
They're camelid, but they
the
don't
camel.
carry as much weight as like
About 70
is
pounds.
a oxen or a horse.
Oh yeah, that's right.
And so these cities were built by hand, and whether or not they were slaves or human labor, it was clearly a very important part of their life to build these, and and things like that. But I do want to make clear that there's just so much Hollywood movies on Native Americans on horseback in the American West fighting the U.S. government. We have to remember that there are no beasts of burden at that time.
That's right.
In the pre-classic Maya, this is a world built by humans on human hands, on human
foot.
backs, on
Exactly
foot,
right.
which
And
makes it even more ridiculous.
we didn't get the horse until about 1700 in North America.
Right,
So,
right. Yeah.
these guys are all on foot. I mean, I here to tell you, and my heart goes out to these people that when I look out here in Idaho and it gets 30 below zero, 40 below zero, and I think about those people that were here 3,000 years ago. How did they
Yeah.
do it? How did they survive it? How, I mean,
Yeah.
my heart goes out to them because that was suffering. That was
Yeah.
suffering, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. And they went through probably a lot of suffering to build these things at Mirador. In your paper, because you had the LIDAR, you could kind of categorize different structures, let's say. And maybe I want to kind of talk about that because I noticed something interesting that you find these, what you call triadic pyramids. So there's
Summits.
three
It's a pyramid with three
summits,
summits on it.
pyramids with three summits. You found E groups and um, yeah, other monumental architecture. Now, explain the significance of these triadic pyramids and what you think they
That's
are.
one of the real interesting features of the begins in about 300 BC. We don't find them yet in earlier than 300 BC. We find pyramids earlier than that, but they're the pyramids like you find in the classic period. But the triadic
Mhm.
structures are again an indication of the ideology as being a prime mover. The reason,
Mm.
the clue that came to this on this one was a guy named Dennis Tedlock, who was doing a study on the Popol Vuh, and his wife happened to overhear a discussion between the Maya priests as they were working, these Maya priests, to translate the Popol Vuh again, talking about the celestial hearth. Hearth. Yes, and Dennis got into this too. What is the celestial hearth? The celestial hearth is in the constellation of Orion. It's the end star of the belt and the two knees. And there's a nebula, and it's called Safe, Regal, and Altanach, the three stars. And there's a nebula in the middle of that called Nebula M42. And that was the fires of creation. Well, just so happens that every Maya household today in the Yucatan Peninsula has the three stone hearth. And every morning the housewife gets up and fans the fires and creates the fire so she can start breakfast and tortillas and tamales and creating life for the family. So what we're thinking is that these three summit pyramids were essentially a symbolic representation of the creation
Mm.
because it ties into that constellation of Orion. Now, that's the
Mm.
idea that we based on ethnographic studies, right? And what it would let you think of is when you see those three buildings as you got on near the summit, found the three buildings at the top. There's a reference there to the creation. It ties them into the gods. It ties them into the deities. That may have been a manipulation by an elite administrative government too, where they utilize ideology is to justify their own positions of power. You know, I am king. I am close to the gods. I have the the symbolism of all the gods around me, and therefore do what I say.
Yeah.
You know, but we find, and just in El Mirador alone, I think we have 37 of those triadic buildings, and we find them in
Yeah.
every pre-classic city throughout the Maya lowlands.
So it was important somehow that having this three maybe linked to the stars. As far as you're aware, they're not for sacrificing that you know
We have
about.
no evidence of that. I mean,
No
they may have
evidence of that.
occurred, but I don't have the evidence for it, and I don't think anybody else does either. There were
Right.
offerings.
Okay.
We have, for example, in the murals of San Bartolo, a scholar named William Saturno discovered these murals at San Bartolo, and these murals are spectacular. They show Maya sacrifices. There's a deer
Hmm.
being sacrificed. There's a turkey being sacrificed. And there's sacrifices, but they're not. You don't see a single human being sacrificed. You see.
Okay. I see. I see. So there could have been even animal sacrifices,
Oh yeah,
perhaps.
there
Oh
was
yeah, for sure.
sacrifice. There was undoubtedly there was sacrifice, but whether or not
Hmm.
there's human, we don't have that evidence. That's all I'm saying.
Okay. Okay. In the classic Maya and post classic, these were societies, correct me if I'm wrong, that were heavily involved in warfare, right? Between themselves.
Absolutely, yeah.
Now, Mirador was sort of unrivaled at its time in size and scale and complexity. let's say around 1 AD or something. Is there any evidence of warfare at Mirador during its apex?
There is, and I'll tell you why.
There is.
There is, but at the very end of that pre-classic occupation, there must have been a stress on the society. For example, at 100 BC, we find they're starting to convert sunken ceremonial plazas into reservoirs, and they're building water collection systems more elaborately. So it must have been kind of a desiccation or a drought, which forced them to look for water. But that was see these subtle changes in architecture and plaza channeling and reservoir construction. But the last big buildings they built were defensive walls and moats.
Okay.
Defensive wall. Those are the last buildings they're building. They're not building defensive walls at the beginning of their occupation. They're building at the very end, toward the very end, which means there must have been some kind of a stress. Now, if you've got corn and I don't, guess who's coming?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
You've got water and I don't, guess who's coming?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so it look like there must have been a stress where they were forced to build these moats, these big, huge trenches that surround these Dantas. Got a big, huge moat that surrounds the pyramid of Danta. And if you look at the map in that paper, you see that big defensive wall around the western section of the city. There's a huge defensive wall there that they built that must have been 15 meters high or even 20 meters high originally, 60-foot wall. And that's a heck of a wall, but that's at the very end of their construction. So that implies some kind of a military threat. Now, the whole basin collapsed around 150 AD, but there must have been a couple hundred people hanging around the ruins. We believe they were probably members of the royal family waiting for the glory days of the past to reappear. So about between 300 and 400 AD, we have evidence of a battle that took place on the Tigre pyramid, where a group of Teotihuacan warriors attacked and slaughtered these people on that building. That's the only building it took place on, because we find none of the evidence of this warfare on any of the other buildings. But the points that they used were from Hyla, Mexico. The Pachuca, the green obsidian from Pachuca, or Tumba, Zaragoza, and Paredon are all obsidian sources close to Teotihuacan. We find that Teotihuacan points, we have found 475 of those atlatl darts on the top of the pyramid, scattered all over. And we found 11 skeletons with the points in the bodies. So they slaughtered these people on that pyramid. Now, why would they slaughter a piddling little group of 100 people? Well, we think Tikal was behind it. We think Tikal, when Mirador collapsed, Tikal began to grow. They apparently were under the thumb of Mirador's power earlier. But when they began to grow, they made a strategic alliance with Teotihuacan. Now, this is before what we call the Entrada of 378 AD, because it looks like they had embassies in Tikal before that date. But it looks like they probably sent out these Teotihuacan warriors to do the dirty work, and that may explain, maybe to some extent, why there was such a hatred between Calakmul, the great site in the northern part of the basin, and Tikal. For centuries and centuries and centuries, there was a warfare event between Calakmul and Tikal. All of the intrigue of military behavior and activity was taking place in the classic period between Tikal and Calakmul. And Calakmul tried to strangle Tikal. They tried to surround them, cut them off from resources. They attacked and sacked and burned Tikal on several occasions. And the great king Hausal Chankawil liberated Tikal from the oppressive thumb of Teotihuacan in 695 AD, and celebrated that event in all of their art and in the monuments and in the architecture. You see, so be a reference to an event that occurred hundreds of years earlier, when the warfare event occurred on Tigre Pyramid. So yeah, they had to have superpower. There was the great site of La Venta, which was an Olmec site in the Gulf Coast of Mexico, was sacked and burned at 400 BC. Who in Mesoamerica at that time would have had the economic, military, and political capability to sack and burn the great Olmec site of La Venta? The only guys I know that would have that capability to do that were these guys at Mirador. And sure enough, at La Venta, we find pre-classic pottery in the upper levels of the city. So I'm very suspicious. What we're lacking is the neutron activation to see if that powder is locally produced or if it came from the area. If we can identify that, we know who the invaders were. And that's something that still needs to happen. It's a great opportunity for a great scholar to go in and find that Maya pottery at La Venta and see and source it, find out where it came from.
When you're talking, you have dates, you have names of people. I know the classic Maya had a system of writing a hieroglyphic style. Did the pre-classic Maya have this same sort of writing system that you can use to decipher dates and people?
Due to great work from epigraphers, we can read the classic period text. We have 94% reading capability now of the classic period text, but we can't read the pre-classic text.
Cannot read the
When the
pre-classic.
collapse occurred, we do have text in the pre-classic. We have bark beaters, for example, where they're making paper as early as 1000 BC, but paper doesn't survive in that environment. And the earliest writing that we have is actually found and painted on a block at San Bartolo, and Saturn dated that to about 400 BC. The earliest writing we have dates to about 300 to 200 BC on stone, and it's incised on stone. It's incisions on stone, but we can't read the text. It's sophisticated language though, because we have prefixes and suffixes on those glyphs, but we can't read it. Nobody can read it. What we need is a larger corpus of pre-classic text, and then somebody will be able to deal with the translation or be able to substitute and find the evidences for that writing system.
Does it look like the classic Maya hieroglyphs?
No, it's different.
Is it like hieroglyphic?
It's
Or how do you
incised.
describe it?
It's incised. It's all incised.
So what do you mean by that?
Well, they incise it in the stone. It's like fine little lines drawn in stone.
Wow.
Yeah.
So that's almost like Sumerian looking, like
It is.
dashes
It's like
and
cuneiform, but cuneiform is more
cuneiform, yeah.
Cuneiform's where they did impression. This is line incised. So they're actually carving cartouches and glyph blocks and putting suffixes or prefixes on it, but it's incised. It's not an elevated text like you find in the classic period.
Earlier when we were talking about the collapse, and you mentioned you think that is an accurate way to describe Mirador because people didn't come back. It was abandoned, and for the most part, I know you mentioned the northern site had a little bit of classic Maya resettlement, but overall, even to this day, present day, Mirador is abandoned.
Well,
And so,
we did have about 700 AD. We did have a group of pilgrims come back into the basin, living
okay,
in the ruins, building
in the ruins.
little houses, but they're not building the big pyramids and the big platforms. They're not building. They're living little houses, but they're
So why'd they
painting
come back?
up. Well, because I think mostly because groups of eccentric artists painting a style of ceramics called Codex style ceramics. And I understand what a Codex pot is, and I happen to have replicas of some of that. Just a minute, let me grab one here. I'll show you a pot, a Codex style ceramic here. This is a
Nice.
replica of a pot that
Cool.
we excavated at Knock Bay, one of these classic guys. This is a Codex style pottery. This is a
Okay.
scribe sitting here on the vessel. He's got a codex, a jaguar skin-bound codex. He's actually writing with his thumbnail on the codex.
Oh, okay.
But this is this cream-colored pot with the black line drawing on it. And this is typical of these artists that are living in the ruins, painting this kind of pottery. We only find this pottery in the Mirador Basin. You'll never find a single piece of this at Tikal or Palenque or Calakmul. I mean, we do find it at Calakmul because it's in the basin. Never find it at Caracol or Chichen Itza or any of these other great sites. You won't find this kind of pottery. And of course, the texts at the top tell us that was for tree fresh chocolate, and that the owner of the vessel was actually a ball player. Actually tells us that he was a Pete C, a ball player. So it gives us information on these dedicatory texts about the vessel and what it contained. And these codex pots are being produced by these people living in the ruins of the pre-classic cities. They're robbing stone. They're robbing stone from the pre-classic buildings and building these houses, but they're not building the big pyramids. They're not building the big platforms. They're just squatting in the ruins.
It kind of reminds me of the stories you hear about after the Colosseum or Rome fell and the Colosseum was used for like grazing goats and sheep and growing artichokes around it. You know that story? Yeah, and they would just like kind of walk through the ruins.
That's right. The Colosseum
And it
has
would
a
been like,
huge history. I mean, of
yeah,
different
like,
functions, of different events, and different uses. Way different from what it was when it was originally.
yeah. hmm Okay, but then for the most part, though, it never was really resettled because we both agree, I think, that it collapsed. Now, today it's kind of a jungle, an overgrown jungle, and there's been some talk about preserving El Mirador as a ecological reserve, a cultural reserve. Now, what's at stake if this thing isn't protected? What's going on in the area today? Can you talk about that?
Well, unfortunately, there's massive deforestation taking place in tropical forests throughout the Americas.
hmm
Massive deforestation in the Amazon for soy production. China is buying all the soy it can get, and they're destroying the forests of the Amazon for soy production. In the basin, the big threat we have is from massive deforestation by organized crime, who are laundering money with cattle. Cattle can't survive in a tropical jungle. They have to have pastures. So you have to clear cut the jungle, burn it to the ground, and then we get the natural grasses growing. The cattle can come in there and they launder money with cattle, and that's a big threat. Actually, a major part of the major threat is occurring right now in the western part of Guatemala and the western part of Mexico. Campeche, Mexico is being heavily burned. So we're going to lose this base unless we change the model. And our suggestion is to neutralize organized crime, you make a wilderness area. I'm from Idaho. We have national parks, we have national monuments, and wilderness areas in the United States. And what I've seen from wilderness areas, they're the same today as they were 60 years ago, same today as they were 100 years ago. And so the idea was to neutralize organized crime. We suggested making the basin, including the southern part of Campeche, a wilderness reserve, a wilderness area, without roads and without airstrips. And that neutralizes the organized crime because they need roads and airstrips to move product to the north. But then these cities are a 3-day hike to the nearest road. How do you get in to see that? What do you suggest we do to get in there to see that? And we've recommended that a miniature train might be the solution. A miniature train, on the ancient causeways, because these
Yeah,
causeways are 40 meters wide and 2 to 5 meters high. They're elevated causeways that were built 3,000 years ago. Why don't we put
yeah.
a train with a track, a foot and a half wide, and takes in 100 passengers? And what that does, it creates no impact on environment, no impact on the animals, no impact on the forest at all, and it provides meaningful and economic employment for the communities that surround the basin. So
Right.
that's
Right.
that's our recommendation, but it's just a recommendation. I'm not involved in economic aspects of it. I don't want to be. I don't have an economic agenda, much to my accusers and the opposition you find on the internet against us, who think we're trying to make it Disneyland, we're out to profit from it, we're trying to destroy the logging concessions, which is false. All this is false. We don't believe that
Mm.
you should log in the basin, though. We think logging in the basin is counterproductive. If you want to log the basin, let's log Tikal too. Let's
Mm.
mine Machu Picchu for the stone there and use that stone for construction of highways out of Cusco. I mean, it's the
Yeah.
same
Yeah.
concept,
It's like, so Mirador doesn't have any protection really from the Guatemalan government today?
El Mirador itself is a national park, but the basin, the majority of the sites are outside the borders of the park. It's in an
Oh,
area
I
we call
see.
the multiple use zone. And our
I see.
idea is we got to protect the system. It's like your hand. Your hand, we're gonna wash that hand. We're gonna take care of it. We're gonna stroke it and bathe it. But the rest of you, we're gonna burn and beat and starve. If
Yeah.
the system dies, what happens to the hand?
Yeah. Yep. It's gone.
You know, the idea is to save the system. And the existing national park is just the hand of the
Yeah.
system. So you got to save the whole system so that the Mexicans and the Guatemalans have a chance for 500 years to still have jungle there, a chance to still have a great tourism business, the chance to do scientific investigations. There's plants out there with huge pharmaceutical values. We know this. We've demonstrated this. We've found this. And there's the remedy for a lot of the world's great diseases is found in these tropical plants. We gotta be,
Hmm.
we gotta understand it before we destroy it. There's a great movie done years and years and years ago by Sean Connery called what was it called? Medicine Man. Get the chance, look that film up. We're in exactly the same position as they were. You know, it's a great film. It's filmed in the Amazon, and it's a
Okay.
great story about a cure for cancer. We think we
Mm.
have the same thing, but we got to understand it. We got to understand the plant. We have to understand the biological systems associated with it. We have to understand how the propagation works. Have to understand the insects that are important for that plant to thrive before we can adequately understand it. And these are drugs that can't be synthesized. So there's great opportunity there if we save these forests, and we can do it through economic justification with these ancient cities.
And you said that you cannot access the basin, the central part of Mirador by foot. You have to be, there are no roads. It's overgrown.
Either hike 3 days or you helicopter in.
Yeah. So and then your idea is that maybe a train, like a train you see at zoos or amusement parks, like a smaller
It's
gauge
exactly
train.
right. A miniature train like you find at zoos. Why do they use them in
Yeah.
zoos? Because they don't impact the animals. They're clean, they're quiet, they're efficient to maintain, they're easy to
Yeah.
maintain, and it provides revenue for the communities, you
'Cause I'm
know.
sure that's the issue they're having is that the people that live by there, if it's near this place, it's probably very economically depressed and they're surviving off of probably illegal logging, poaching,
Of course,
or
looting.
yeah, like you're saying, looting or laundering money through cattle. And if they don't have any other options, like developing another industry where they can make money, they're just going to continue to do that. Is that
But again,
that's what you're?
it's a change. It's a change that creates the opposition. Look what's going on right now in the U.S. The change that's taking place right now is creating all kinds of opposition, and it's a stupid opposition. It's an
Mhm.
opposition that nobody can really understand, but it's occurring, you know.
Yeah. So
And
you,
so we find the same thing. And when you try to change a society that's living on logging and poaching and looting and prostitution and whatever, when you try to change that model, there's always a resistance.
yeah, yeah. So I'm assuming you've received some resistance on these ideas from the
We
people
receive
of.
death threats.
Oh wow. And these have included from organized crime in the area. Do you get any support from like the Guatemalan government at a national level?
We get support from the government for the permits and the authority to do the work in their country. And I have 33 archaeologists that work with us when we're in the season. And 98% are Guatemalans. We employ
Got
up
it.
to 400 workmen. So we provide
Yeah,
huge economic input in the country trying to save this area. But we don't have any money from the government of Guatemala. We don't really want it. I prefer that they invest in protection for these sites. They invest in non-wood resource. For example, why aren't they
yeah,
building
yeah,
bottling plants for rainforest honey? Why aren't they putting a mill to grind the Ramon nut, a high protein nut, into a flour that could be exported all over the world as a substitute for flour? It's a high protein flour. It's a great
yeah.
product, and there's thousands of tons of it that rot every year in the basin from the Ramon tree. Why aren't they
Mm,
putting those kinds of things in these villages? So as a replacement for the logging, you know.
mm,
And by the way, the
yeah,
old days in the past where we got to save forest because it's pretty and green and has orchids and monkeys. Those days are gone. That's a romanticism that a lot of environmental organizations use today, and it's bogus. And the reason it is because the starving peasant doesn't care.
yeah,
If he sees
yeah.
a
If
monkey in
you're
the tree,
the
he's going to shoot it and eat it. You know.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
you have to involve
yes,
them in economic models, and you have to make them a part of the pie, of the economic pie, and that way they'll defend it. They'll work to save it if they're a part of the action. And that's why we think ecotourism is the solution to permanent rainforest conservation. And the secret we have in the basin of Guatemala is all these ancient cities that are there. You're going to want to come see
yeah.
them. You're going to want to be
I
a
would
part
love
of
to.
it. And we want the people
Yeah,
to make the money by taking you in there and explaining it to you, you see.
yeah, yes.
So
That's pretty fantastic.
the challenge is converting them from an exploitation model to a conservation model. And that
Yeah,
means you got to
yeah.
teach them how to speak the languages they need. They need French and German and English at least to be able to explain the things to people. They have to learn how to make meals that are acceptable to a tourism industry. They have to learn how to make eco hotels that are acceptable and nice and still compatible with the environment. And this is all things that would involve NGOs to do and it can become involved with in a model that would create an economic justification for the conservation.
Because you would have to put some infrastructure in Mirador for this train to, a destination for the train to stop. So you'd need
But
a
it's minimal,
hotel, you
minimal.
a minimal like bathrooms,
Well,
clean
in
water.
Hawaii, you've got a great example. You got the Pineapple Express. You ever been on that little train?
I have not, but I know exactly what you're talking about at the Dole Plantation up near the
Exactly
North
right.
Shore. Yeah, yeah,
Exactly right. Go take a
and
ride
that's how
on it.
you
You see the vision here.
yeah, and that's how you're envisioning,
That's right.
engaging the local communities and the Guatemalan government
That's right.
to change us from an exploitative to seeing that this thing could be useful. If we treat it sustainably, could be a sustainable source of revenue for the people there.
We don't cut trees. We go around them
Yeah. Yeah. For the
on the
I would say
causeway.
on the
You know,
causeways, yeah. And they're already built-in
they
causeways. It's
already
like, come
built.
on,
That's
we
right.
can already
That's
have the map.
exactly
You have
right.
the map, a LIDAR. You can just, already have everything you need to get around the city. It sounds like, even though it's huge, I couldn't believe it too when I was looking at your LIDAR data. I was like, this is just absolutely enormous. And I just to touch back into it, LIDAR, which we defined earlier, the light detection and ranging, it is revolutionizing archaeology around the world because we can map stuff on the surface in 3 dimensions in ways we couldn't before. And so,
It's a
yeah,
military technology that has huge applications in many, many
mhm.
ways.
And I've seen it being used for finding sites like mounds across the US, like earthen mounds of animals and things like that.
Right.
Marching bear. Those are all really it's just amazing to see it from the
Great
large
sites like
scale.
Watson Brake,
Oh,
whoever would see it.
Watson Brake.
Yeah,
Yeah, well, that's an old one. Watson Brake's like 5,000 year old. That's the earliest
exactly right.
example of earthen monumental architecture in the Americas, period. Right?
Exactly right.
Yeah, and that's in Louisiana, of
Right.
all places. Poverty Point's another
That's
interesting one
another one.
down there, but that's like about 3,000 years ago. I've been there personally and actually cored a lake at Poverty Point. And yeah, but at the lake, we're working at this lake next to the big mound. And one of our undergrad students is like, oh, look at this. And we found one of those little weights, these beautiful weights. They don't even know what they make them, but what they use them for exactly is either nets or fishing.
Right,
But we
right.
found one like sitting right on the ground, right next to the big site. And the archaeologist came out and had to like document it. And like, that's how much stuff is just still around Poverty Point to this day. But I want to see it being used more up in, I have research projects going at the copper districts in Michigan for the archaic copper for North America. And there's still pits and mines up there.
Right.
They are they've done LIDAR before, but those were those airplane flyovers and they're not as high resolution. But with, I think, the drone technology, especially if you go after the leaves fall, there are some sections on around Lake Superior where I think LIDAR would really help us understand the old copper mine pits and stuff, because the same thing is going on there. It's thick, boreal forest. Up on Isle Royal, there's no vehicles. It's a whole island of, on foot in swamps, and it's impossible to really see much. But I think LIDAR there will revolutionize stuff, just like it has been in the Amazon basin, which is I've been emailing people on recent papers that have come out of the Amazon, and I haven't got anyone to agree to be on yet, but I do want to get some of these Amazon researchers on this channel too.
It's a fascinating subject, and it's it was a major surprise to me, but I'm glad to see it because it shows that there was incredible development in tropical forests where we thought
Yeah,
only hunters and gatherers can thrive.
right, right. And this has all changed for the viewer. This has all changed since like I mean, early 2000s. This is a recent development where they thought the Amazon was this untouched wilderness full of hunter gatherers to, whoa, there was huge cities out there dependent on agriculture, creating causeways, creating monumental architecture. And they were doing it thousands of years before contact with the Europeans.
Exactly right.
And same thing seems to have happened up through Central America in Guatemala and what have you. Now, to sign
One of
us
the things
off.
we did that's a little different, you'll notice in that paper, we
Mhm,
took what we found is to be able to put categories on the sites. We took
mhm,
a square kilometer of any section of any site you wanted and quantified the volume of material in in that square kilometer. You could select any section you wanted and calculate the volume of material that's contemporaneous. Has to
mhm,
be contemporaneous. Doesn't make Some of my colleagues are saying we've got 50,000 buildings, but half of them are pre-classic, half of them are early classic, half of them are late classic. They're not contemporaneous. So you have to make sure that the architecture is contemporaneous. You quantify the volume, and that gives you the ability to compare different sites. And that's why you get that range of site
mm,
sizes and site complexities based on
mhm,
any square kilometer, and it can be replicated in any site in the Maya lowlands. You can take that same
mm,
model and go to any site in the Maya lowlands and see how they compare to other sites. And it gave us the ability to see the size and scale of El Mirador compared to the satellite cities that surround it.
What is one thing you wish more people understood about the ancient Maya and the pre-classic period in general?
Well, there are 5 great civilizations of the world that are what we call the founding civilization of the world. And these are civilizations that developed their own writing. The Maya are the only society that had a true writing, a true script. We have the Chinese, you have the Harappans of India, you have the Mesopotamians, you have the Egyptians, and you have the Mesoamerican, Maya and
So the
Olmec.
only writing in the Americas.
In the
Then.
Americas, there's no writing anywhere in
Right.
South America. No writing
No
anywhere
writing
in
in
North
South.
America. The only place you have
Yes.
a written script that could be read and understood and transmitted and recorded is in Mesoamerica. And the Maya were developed it to the max. The Maya were the most prolific writers of any group in Mesoamerica or in the Americas. So we have to realize that they deserve a place at the table of world civilizations.
Yeah.
And it's a
Yes.
fascinating study. I mean, it's a fascinating study to see who these people were and how they managed to do what they did in a difficult environment and how they
Yeah.
pulled it off and what they did right and the communication systems they built, the huge causeway systems. We didn't get into the industrial age until what happened in the U.S. We built the Transcontinental Railroad, and then we started building the highway systems. We have the freeway system now, right?
Yeah.
That's our communication system. That's what allows us to move product from San Francisco to New York and vice versa. And it keeps us it lets us be a homogeneous society. It lets us be a prosperous society. It allows for exchange of ideas and products and services that we never would have had the ability to do. The Maya learned that, 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago. They learned that, and that's one of the things they did that was successful. There's a warning there to all other countries. If you want to prosper, develop your communication systems so that you can, by meaning transport of products, services, and food materials to your cities, so your population can eat. And you're not out looking for gophers and grasshoppers to eat tomorrow.
And you can move armies and.
Exactly right. And you can move ideology concepts, and you can move, you have you have police control. You have to have the ability to do that. So
Great. Well, Richard, I think on that note, I think we can wrap up our conversation here. It's been nice talking with you.
thank
Do
you, David.
you have anything you want to say? Any shout outs for your project or any papers to look out
You
for?
can look us up at miradorbasin.com.
Okay.
We need all the financial support we get. I gotta pay mules. We have 126 mules that haul supplies in. It takes a week to make a round trip. I need money for workmen and cooks and our conservation experts that are out there as we're exposed. We're the only project that's out there doing major restoration of buildings. By restoration, I mean consolidation. We don't invent buildings. We simply expose what's there, but consolidate it so that it doesn't fall down anymore. We're
Okay.
doing that. We're making these sites touristically visible. You can come see them. There are tourist companies all over Guatemala that can take you in there, and we invite the world to come see it. One of the great civilization of the world. You can also see some of the great stories on videos. Look at the Discovery Channel Expedition Unknown. We did six episodes of Expedition Unknown on the Discovery Channel. Look up CNN specials. We've done specials, a lot of National Geographic specials. The one I still like, and it was one of the earlier ones, was The Dawn of the Maya, DAWN, The Beginning of the Maya, a National Geographic special. And that kind of tells a story about the swamps and about the stonework and about the deforestation and about how these society became sophisticated. It talks about the San Bartolo murals and the art found in Eastern Petén. It is a great story. So we invite you to take advantage of that. Help us save this area. We actually figure we have 5 to 6 years to save this. If we don't save it, it'll be lost to organized crime. And there will never be a tourist ever again going to these areas. Never again. So, we're in a bitter battle. We're in a fight to save this. We have tremendous interest from European countries, and I've just got back from Europe. I was in Europe and Holland. Tremendous interest from Holland in this. Tremendous interest in France and Germany and Spain to try to save these areas. Sweden's interested. We can save this area. Then we have one of the great solutions for world problems. Everybody's talking about climate change. We have a solution. Save the jungle. We can save it through economic justification. We can provide these ancient cities, provide the revenue to justify that conservation. And we invite the world to be a part of it.
Great. That is take a look at the website for Richard mentioned. It was mirador.com.
Mirador Basin.
Miradorbasin.com if you want to donate and help Richard and his colleagues save Mirador.
We have a field school too that you can find at the Idaho State University anthropology webpage. Look up field schools, and we have a field school out there for students that might want to get involved. And that starts in the 6th of July through the 10th of August. They actually teach you how to excavate, how to survive in a tropical jungle, and how to be all the multidisciplinary approach. We're not just doing archaeology. We're doing all kinds of other multidisciplinary projects, such as entomology, the study of insects, herpetology, study of reptiles. That we're doing the botany of the basin. We're doing the ornithology, the birds of the basin. We're doing all these simultaneously so that we have a better picture of the dynamics that led to the creation of one of the greatest civilizations in the world.
Amazing. Well, Richard, I hope you keep exploring until next time, or maybe if you publish another paper, we'll have you on again to talk.
More coming out. We've got a bunch more coming out. Yeah, we do.
And I'm looking forward to reading them.
Send me your email, David. Send me your email. And by the way, if anybody wants to contact my email is miradorbasin@gmail.com.
Okay. miradorbasin@gmail.com for those who are out there. Any students they're interested in the field school, they're running it out of Idaho. All great information, Richard. Wonderful. I'm glad we got to have this conversation after a little bit of a hiccup this morning, but it's all good now. Yeah, right. I think that's
Appreciate your time, and let's do it again sometime. Invite you to come see it, David. You got to come see this.
I'd love to.
One of the great ancient cities of the Western Hemisphere, and it's just now being uncovered.
Will do. I'll keep it on my bucket list.
Right.
Okay.
Good. Bye. Thanks a lot. Have a good one.
Bye.